Everyone knows the story. Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, born to bring balance to the Force, the boy the prophecy pointed to. What almost nobody talks about is that he wasn't the beginning of anything. He was a repeat, a second attempt at a role the galaxy had already invented, filled once and then buried in a war so old that by Anakin's time, even the Jedi had forgotten it happened. Here's the thread I want to pull. The prophecy asks the Chosen One to bring balance to the Force. The Jedi spend the entire prequel era acting like they know what that means. They don't, not really, because the word at the center of the whole thing, balance, didn't originate with them. It came from an order that existed roughly 10,000 years before there was a single Jedi, an order whose name the Jedi still carry, worn down and mispronounced, without seeming to notice what it used to stand for. Say Jedi slowly and you're almost there. Jedaii, that's the older word, that's who came first. And the difference between the two isn't just a few dropped letters across 10 millennia. The Jedi believe something the Jedi would have called heresy, something that, if you take it seriously, completely rewrites what Anakin was actually sent to do. This is going to take us to a planet most fans have never heard of, orbited by 2 moons that ran an entire religion. It's going to take us through a schism that had nothing to do with good and evil, and a war the official canon still won't fully show you. And it's going to end back where we started, with a boy conceived by the Force itself, handed a prophecy that his own teachers had spent thousands of years misreading. I'll be straight with you about where the sources are solid and where they go quiet, because the quiet parts are honestly the most interesting. But we start with the name, because before Jedi meant the guardians of peace, the light against the dark, the good guys in brown robes, it meant something else entirely. So what did it mean before it meant this? Stand on Tython for a second. It's roughly 25,000 years before Anakin will ever draw breath, and the sky over your head is doing something no sky in the later galaxy does. 2 moons hang up there. Not decoration, not background. The whole world is organized around them. One of them is pale, calm, the kind of light you'd want to sit under. That's Ashla. The other is dark, heavy, the sort of thing you instinctively don't turn your back on. That's Bogan. And the people who live here didn't name those moons after 2 aspects of the Force by accident, then go about their day. They built a life around the idea that both of those moons were real, both were necessary, and that losing your footing between them could get you killed. I mean that literally. On Tython, when the Force fell out of balance, the planet answered. Force storms, violent, physical, planet-scarring storms driven by the Force itself, would tear across the surface. This is straight out of the Dawn of the Jedi comics, the Force Storm arc that opens the whole era. Balance on Tython wasn't a moral position you could argue about over dinner. It was weather. It was the difference between a calm horizon and the sky coming apart. And these weren't a handful of local mystics who stumbled into the idea. The people on Tython had been gathered there. 9 enormous pyramid ships called the Thoyor swept across the galaxy and pulled Force sensitives out of dozens of worlds. Humans, Twi'leks, Wookiees, Cathar, even members of the species that would one day be called Sith, and carried all of them to this one planet under these 2 moons. A whole cross-section of the galaxy dropped into a single place and told, in effect, figure out how to hold the middle or the storms come. That's the setup nobody teaches you before they teach you about Jedi. 2 moons, 1 rule that came out of them. And that rule is where things get strange, because it breaks almost everything you think you know about the people in brown robes who came after. Here's the rule, and it's the part that should stop you. If a Jedi leaned too far into the dark, too much Bogan, too much anger, hunger, appetite, they were pulled out and sent to recenter. That part you'd expect. Any order polices its darkness. But the Jedi did something the later Jedi never would have dreamed of. If you lean too far into the light, too much Ashla, too much serenity, too much of what the Jedi would later call virtue, they came for you too. Read that again, because it's easy to skim past. Being too good at the light was a failure. Prisoner of Bogan, the second Dawn of the Jedi arc, is built around exactly this. A Jedi who tips too far in either direction gets exiled to the opposite moon. Too dark and you're sent up to Ashla to cool down. But too bright, too pure, too far into the light, and they banished you to the dark moon, to Bogan, to the exact place the later Jedi taught their younglings to fear. Sit with how alien that is. Everything the order of the prequels stood for, the calm, the detachment, the suppression of anything that smelled like the dark side. The Jedi would have looked at all of it and diagnosed a Jedi as sick, out of balance, a patient who'd wandered too far up one slope and needed to be walked back down toward the other. because the Jedi didn't walk in the light. They walked between. The whole discipline was staying in that narrow band where both moons pulled on you at once and neither one owned you. Not light triumphing over dark, not dark corrupting light. A person standing in the middle of both, on purpose, holding steady, because that was the only place the storms didn't come. Now hold that next to the order Anakin was raised in. An order that made the light its single goal. That treated any drift toward the dark as the beginning of the end. That named a boy the Chosen One and told him his job was to bring balance, while practicing something the founders of the word would have called the opposite of balance. So if excess light was a sin to the people who invented the whole idea, then what exactly were the Jedi? And how did an order that started in the middle end up so far up one side of the mountain that it forgot the other slope was even there? The answer starts with the word itself. Jedi. In the Dai Bendu tongue, the old language the first ones on Tython spoke, it's usually rendered as something close to mystic center. I'll be honest that this is Legend's flavor more than hard scripture. The exact translation drifts a little depending on which source you're reading, but hold on to the shape of it. Not mystic light, not mystic warrior. Center. The name is the whole philosophy folded into a single word. These were the people of the middle.
And that word didn't just fade out, it got worn down. Say it enough times over 10,000 years, let it pass through enough mouths and enough languages, and Jedi softens into Jedi. Same word, sanded smooth. Which means every time a Jedi Master in the prequels says the name of their own order out loud, they're saying center, the one thing they stopped being. The 9 Tho-Yor that carried everyone to Tython didn't just drop their passengers and leave either. They settled across the planet and became the foundations of 9 great temples, each one tied to a different aspect of Force practice. The Forge, the Flame, the deep science of the Force, the martial side, the meditative side. You didn't pick a side of the Force and stay there for life. A Jedi was expected to move between the temples, to study all of it, to be uncomfortable on purpose. The architecture itself was built to keep you from settling. For a while, it worked. A whole order of people trained to live in tension, under 2 moons, in 9 temples, holding the center against the storms. It's genuinely one of the more beautiful ideas in all of Star Wars, and it's buried in comics most people never opened. But an idea like that only survives as long as nothing tests it. And something was about to. Because the center only holds when the pressure comes from inside, when it's your own students drifting too far up one slope. It's a very different thing when the pressure comes from outside, when it comes down out of the sky with its own plans for Tython and no interest at all in your balance. Something came down from orbits, and it did not come to keep the balance. For thousands of years, the only real threat to the Jedi had been themselves. Their whole system was built for internal drift, a student sliding too far toward one moon, a temple growing too proud. Every tool they had was designed for that. Exile to Bogan, a season on Ashla. Correction from within. None of it was built for an enemy that didn't care about the middle at all. Then one arrived. An outside power, reaching Tython from beyond the system, with its own designs on the planet and on the people who could touch the Force. In the wider Legends timeline, this is the shadow of the Rakata, the Infinite Empire, a civilization that harvested Force sensitives and bent the dark side into an engine of conquest. To them, a whole world of trained Force users wasn't a philosophy to respect, it was a resource. Now, here's where I owe you honesty, because it's the honest gaps that make this era feel real rather than tidy. Dawn of the Jedi, the comic series telling this story, was cancelled before it ever fully put the invasion and its aftermath on the page. What we have is the opening, the setup, the shape of the threat, and then reference material filling in what the comics never got to draw. So when I say war came to Tython, I'm standing on solid ground. When someone tells you they know every beat of how it played out, they're filling in blanks the canon itself left empty. But the core of it is clear enough, and it's the part that matters. An order that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of standing in the middle suddenly faced a question the middle has no answer for. When something comes for everything you are, and it will not stop, and it does not negotiate, what does balance even mean anymore? That's not a moral question, that's a survival question. And it's about to break the order in half. How do you hold the middle
middle against an enemy that has no middle? That's the question, and if you actually sit in it for a moment, you feel how airless it is. The Jedi doctrine assumed a shared game. It assumed both sides of the Force wanted equilibrium, that the pull of Ashla and the pull of Bogan roughly canceled if you stood in the right spot. Balance is a thing you keep with a partner who's also trying to keep it. It falls apart the instant the other party stops playing. An invader bent on conquest is not trying to balance anything, it's trying to win. And you cannot answer a war of extermination by standing serenely in the center and hoping the tension resolves itself. The center in that situation isn't wisdom, it's a target that doesn't move. So part of the Order made a choice. If holding the middle meant losing everything, then some of them would stop holding it. They would reach for Bogan, reach for the dark not as corruption, not as a fall from grace, but as a weapon. Because the dark side, whatever else it is powerful, and power is what a war demands. This is the fracture the whole era turns on, and it's why the angle we started with matters so much. The split didn't happen over good versus evil. Nobody in that moment was cackling about embracing evil. They were people staring down annihilation, deciding that survival was worth picking up the moon they'd spent their whole lives keeping at arm's length. And that reframes everything the later galaxy would say about the dark side. The first great embrace of Bogan wasn't a temptation. It wasn't weakness or ambition or a Sith Lord whispering in someone's ear. It was a wartime decision by people trying not to die, which makes the label the galaxy would slap on it for the next 25,000 years, dark, evil, the enemy, feel less like a truth and more like the winners writing history. That decision saved lives. It may have saved the Order's future entirely, and it cursed the name forever because it lit the fuse on the one event the canon still won't let us watch. The most important event in the Order's history is the one you're barely allowed to see. It's called the Force Wars. Somewhere around 25,000 years before the films, the fracture on Tython finished tearing open, and the two halves of the Order, those still holding the middle and those who'd taken up Bogan as a weapon, went to war. Not a metaphorical war of ideas, a real one, with the Force itself as the weapon on both sides, on a planet that already answered in balance with storms. Everything the Jedi had spent 10,000 years building came down in it. And here's the strange, almost frustrating thing. For an event this foundational, the literal hinge between the Jedi and the Jedi, we have shockingly little of it on the page. Dawn of the Jedi was building toward the Force Wars when the series was cancelled. The war that ends one order and begins the next. The war that everything after it depends on got left as backstory, a line in a reference book, a shadow the later canon gestures at without ever standing inside. I find that genuinely fascinating rather than disappointing. The single most consequential conflict in the deep history of the Force is a blank the storytellers walked right up to and then stepped away from. Which means when Anakin's Jedi talk about balance thousands of years later, they're invoking the outcome of a war they've never seen described in full either. They inherited the result without the record. What we do know is the result. When the storms cleared and the Force Wars ended, the Jedi Order as it had existed was gone. Out of the survivors, a new order took shape. One that would gather itself, leave the ruins behind, and eventually take a new, worn-down version of the old name, the Jedi. But they didn't just change the name when they walked out of that war, they changed what they believed. And the thing they decided to leave buried in the rubble of Tython is the exact thing that would come back to haunt a slave boy from Tatooine. Picture the two of them side by side. A Jedi, standing on Tython under two moons, trained to hold anger and serenity in the same hands and trust neither. And a Jedi of the Republic, thousands of years later, sitting in a gleaming temple on Coruscant, taught from infancy to fear the faintest flicker of the dark in himself. Same lineage, same worn-down name, almost opposite creatures. Because somewhere in the aftermath of the Force Wars, the survivors made a decision, and it's the decision that defines everything the prequels are about. They looked at what embracing Bogan had done, the war, the ruin, the friends who'd reached for the dark and been consumed by it, and they concluded the whole idea had been a mistake. Not just excess dark, the middle itself. If reaching for Bogan led here, then the safest thing, the only survivable thing, was to reject it completely. To stop walking between the moons and start walking only in the light. You can trace the residue of this in the later reference material, Book of Sith, the deep history write-ups from the Old Republic era, where the New Order defines itself against the dark rather than in balance with it.
Detachment becomes doctrine. Fear of the dark side becomes the central discipline. The temples where a Jedi once had to study the martial and the hungry and the aggressive sides of the Force get quietly abandoned because those sides are now the enemy. And I want to be fair to them because it wasn't stupidity, it was trauma. They had watched the middle path burn down a planet. Choosing the light wasn't arrogance, it was a people flinching away from the thing that had nearly destroyed them and building a religion around the flinch. But flinching has a cost, and theirs was enormous. Because when you decide the dark is simply evil, simply the enemy, simply the thing to be eliminated, you have to change what your oldest word means to make that make sense.
And their oldest word, the one buried under 10,000 years and one catastrophic war, was balance. They didn't just forget the old meaning, they overwrote it. And the new meaning is a mistranslation the entire galaxy would end up believing. Here's the mistranslation, stated plainly. When the Jedi of the Republic said bring balance to the Force, what they meant, what they actually operated on, was destroy the dark. Think about what a strange sentence that is. Balance, by any ordinary reading of the word, means two things held in equilibrium. It's a scale with weight on both pans. It's the middle the Jedi built their entire existence around. But the Jedi had spent thousands of years redefining the dark side as pure corruption, an aberration, a sickness in the Force. And once the dark is a sickness, balance stops meaning equilibrium and starts meaning health. Cure the patient, cut out the tumor. Balance becomes the light standing alone, restored to what they decided was its natural state. This is the fault line running under the whole prophecy, and it's a genuine one, not something I'm inventing. There are two live readings of what bring balance to the Force even means, and they point in opposite directions. There's the older reading, the Jedi reading. Balance is the middle, both moons pulling, neither winning. And there's the reading the prequel Jedi lived by. Balance is the dark side eliminated, and the light left in peace. George Lucas himself leaned toward that second one, the light as the Force's natural condition, the dark as an imbalance to be corrected. So the ambiguity isn't a fan theory, it's baked into the story at the level of the man who made it. But notice what that means. The Jedi weren't just interpreting the prophecy, they were interpreting it through a doctrine that a Jedi would have called broken. Asking someone to bring balance and meaning make the light win is, to the people who coined the word, a contradiction. It's like asking someone to level a scale by throwing away everything on one side, so the prophecy could have been misread before the chosen one was ever born. The word was corrupted long before the boy arrived to fulfill it. And the wild part, the part that should make the hair on your neck stand up, is that the canon we watch on screen actually remembers the older meaning. It just puts it in the mouth of a monster. There's a creature in Star Wars Rebels that says the quiet part out loud, and almost nobody clocks what it's really doing. He's called the Bendu. He shows up on a remote world, enormous, ancient, voiced by Tom Baker in this low rumble that sounds like the planet itself is talking. Kanan asks him what he is, whether he's light or dark, and the Bendu tells him he's neither. He's the one in the middle. Between the Ashla, the light, and the Bogan, the dark. Stop and register what just happened there. Ashla, Bogan. Those aren't new words invented for the show. Those are the two moons of Tython. That's the Jedi's exact vocabulary. The light and the dark, named the way they were named 25,000 years earlier, spoken now in canon on screen by a being who defines himself as the one who stands between them. The heresy the Jedi buried in the rubble of the Force Wars didn't stay buried. Canon dug it up and gave it a voice. And it isn't a one-off. The Lasat, the species Zeb comes from, use the Ashla as their own word for the light side of the Force. The old term surviving in a living culture. And go back to the Clone Wars, to the Mortis arc, and you find the whole idea dramatized as a family. A father who keeps the balance, a son who is the dark, a daughter who is the light. The father's entire purpose is to hold his two children in check, to be the one in the middle, and he spends the arc terrified of what happens when he's gone, and there's no one left to hold the center. That's the Jedi philosophy, wearing a robe and calling itself a family. It's in canon, it's on screen, it's just never labeled. So the balance the Jedi Order forgot, the equilibrium they overwrote with Destroy the Dark, the deeper canon never actually let it die. It kept whispering the old meaning through a monster, through a species' prayers, through a dying god on Mortis, which forces forces the question the whole video has been walking toward. If balance really means the middle, if that's what the Force itself keeps insisting through every one of these figures, then what were they actually asking of the boy? When the prophecy said Anakin would bring balance, what was he really being sent to do? A boy on a desert planet, no father, conceived by the Force itself. And into his hands, the galaxy places a word it no longer understands. Start with how he arrived, because it matters. Anakin has no father. The Force made him, the midichlorians, the will of the thing itself, depending on which layer of the story you trust. Revenge of the Sith slips in that Darth Plagueis could manipulate life and death, and leaves you to wonder whether Palpatine's master reached into the desert and did this on purpose. The film never answers it, and I think it's stronger for not answering. Either way, the point stands. Anakin isn't born the way people are born. He's born the way the prophecy said the chosen one would be. Out of the Force, directly, with no one in between. Which is almost unbearably fitting when you think about what he was for. The Jedi believed you held the middle by containing both moons inside one person. And here is a person the Force built from scratch with no half measures, no ordinary parentage diluting him. A vessel, if you wanted one, for exactly that. The most balanced being imaginable if anyone had remembered what balance meant, but nobody had. The Order that raised him had spent thousands of years training the middle out of itself. They took this boy, this walking argument for holding both sides at once, and they handed him a doctrine that said the dark in him was a flaw to be feared and cut away. They read his prophecy as destroy the Sith. They asked the most balanced creature the Force ever made to pick a side. And here's the cruelty of it. A true Jedi standing under two moons would never have asked Anakin to destroy the dark. They'd have asked him to hold it, to walk between, to do the one thing his teachers had forgotten was even possible. The dark side wasn't supposed to be his enemy. It was supposed to be half of him, the half a Jedi would have taught him to carry without letting it carry him. Instead, they taught him to fear it. And you cannot hold what you've been taught to fear. You can only be swallowed by it. He fell not because he was weak, but because he was raised by an order that had lost the very skill his prophecy required. The skill of standing in the middle without breaking. They forgot how to hold the center, so he couldn't hold his own. So let me turn the whole thing over one last time. What if Anakin never fell at all? Not in the way we've been told. We treat his story as a descent. The chosen one, corrupted, dragged down into the dark, redeemed at the very end when he throws the Emperor down that shaft and dies in the light. Balance restored. That's the reading the Jedi would give you, and it's the reading the film seemed to confirm. He destroys the Sith. The dark is eliminated. The scale, in their language, is level again. But run it through the older meaning, the Jedi meaning, and the same events look completely different. A being made to hold both moons refuses all his life to be only one thing. He's the Order's brightest hope and its deepest fear. He loves too fiercely for a Jedi, hungers too openly, holds on to people the way they told him never to. Every instinct the Jedi tried to train out of him was, by the older creed, the middle trying to reassert itself through a boy who was built for it. When he finally turns on the Emperor, he isn't a fallen man clawing back to the light. He's a person who spent his whole life being told to pick a side, choosing, in the end, the one thing neither the Sith nor the Jedi ever wanted him to be. His own. I'm not saying that erases what he did. The children on the temple floor are still on the floor. But the framing we inherited, the fall, the redemption, the light winning, is the Jedi's framing. And the Jedi are the ones who lost the meaning of the word in the first place. Of course their version ends with the dark destroyed. It's the only ending their doctrine can imagine. Which brings us back to where we started. Anakin Skywalker was not the first chosen one. He was the return of a role the galaxy built an entire world around and then abandoned in a war it won't even show us. The Jedi asked their people to stand in the middle. The Jedi forgot how, changed the word, and spent the rest of their history calling the middle darkness. And then a boy arrived, made by the Force, carrying the old role in his blood, handed to teachers who no longer had the language to explain what he was. The name survived the Order. Jedi wore down to Jedi, and the sound of it lasted 25,000 years. The meaning didn't. It slipped out of the words somewhere on a burning planet under two moons, and it's been waiting ever since. In a monster's voice, in a dying god on Mortis, in a slave boy who was never taught what he was for. Maybe balance was never something the Jedi could restore. Maybe he was only ever waiting for someone who remembered what it meant.